Welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipsson.
Today's guest is Bas Schnater, a fan engagement consultant and an award-winning data analytics expert. In this episode, you will learn about fan engagement, how fan engagement has changed during COVID, will the fans return to the stadiums, and much more. Bas Schnater, welcome to Sports Management Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm very glad to have you. And today we will talk about you, of course, and your career, but also a lot about fan engagement. But before we kick off, how are you?
All good. It's now on when we're recording this is the 19th of January. It's halfway through January. I've been good. A bit boring Christmas days because, as everyone these days, I had COVID, so not very cool anymore to have that. But all recovered and back to work.
I'm glad to hear that you're doing well. So you say that you are back to work. So what is it that you do?
Yeah, I do two things. I have my job that I do a big part of my week, and I have my own consultancy in fan engagement, actually, where I help football organizations. It has a couple of layers. It has a digital layer where I help them to understand who their fans are better. So it's more of a data analytics, data science area, plus the fan engagement area, which is solely focused on match days. But yeah, as you understand, with the pandemic for the last 2 years, we've barely been able to go to the stadium. So that part has kind of went into hibernation until we can all go back to stadiums again. I know that at the moment we are the only country in Europe that has actually full restrictions on stadiums. So we're the only ones playing without any fans. But yeah, a lot of countries, at least they're getting some fans back to the stadiums.
I didn't know that about Netherlands. That's interesting. And for Sweden, we had regulations of 500 people.
Mm-hmm.
Then when they thought it was getting better, they opened it up, and now they have closed it down again to 500 per section.
Per section. Okay, so there's at least that make more sense.
Yeah, if the stadium can make sure that the different sections are not interacting with each other, then it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, so we are living in the pandemic times. At least I thought that last summer maybe that was the end of it, and here we are. And
we all hope that.
Yeah, exactly. The pandemic has obviously affected so many things. But if we talk about the fan engagement, it's very interesting because, as we just said, fans cannot attend the stadiums sometimes. So how have you seen the sports organization adapting to this change?
Interesting question. I've seen quite some interesting initiatives, and strategically you saw a couple of things happening. When first the pandemic hit and all of a sudden all stadiums were closed, you could see that the clubs were first seeing how long this was going to take. Is it going to take a couple of weeks? Try to ride it out. But as soon as they realized that was not happening, you could see that some clubs starting with these small initiatives like Aarhus in Denmark that put massive screens next to the stadium. So you could see on the screen while you were watching on TV, you could see big screens next to the stadium. And I believe that's the same club that also did a drive-through at some point that you could go with cars to the stadium where they would have a big screen. And those were sort of the first initiatives. And over the longer the pandemic stayed, more initiatives started showing. So I know that in England, for example, Liverpool has been very active in approaching its disabled fans because they are usually more prone to be in less of a bigger social circle, whatever. And Liverpool made sure that they were actually checking in on fans that they knew they were more vulnerable on how are you going, how's your mental health, can we help with anything. Then I saw initiatives starting up on clubs preparing food packages to deliver at home. So I think it was Southampton, who did that. That actually delivered food packages at home for fans that were in quarantine. And now there's still new initiatives popping up. Of course, football clubs had to move their communications and their relationship elements to the online sphere, but it's not the same. I've seen some very good initiatives, but to me, digital is not about relationship building. It's about relationship maintaining. And where you actually build the relationship and improve it and make it stronger, that is with those physical interactions. So bringing those boxes to houses, checking in on fans, that is improving the relationship. And yeah, loads of initiatives. Some clubs were the first, other clubs started copying that, but that's great. Copy those good initiatives, because in the end, you want to have that same impact on your fan base as that Liverpool did, or that Southampton did, or Brentford, or whichever club.
Yeah, that's very interesting with especially the non-digital aspect of it, as you said there, and that the digital is mostly to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
So now when you're working with your consultancy on these topics, what are some things that you advise them to with regards to fan engagement?
It depends a bit per question what the club has, basically. And there's not really a one-size-fits-all, although most football clubs do struggle with a bit of the same issues. And of course, one of the big issues that clubs were facing over the last 2 years on how can I move my business online, basically. Because clubs have been very late with adopting these digital transformations, because you always have the comfort of money flowing in anyways via sponsorships or whatever. So investing in that fan relationship has never really been the main driver, where you see in e-commerce, for example, you have to invest in the customer relationship or else they go elsewhere. In football, in sports in general, that was never really the case. So now you saw all of a sudden the shock modus at football clubs of, oh wow, now I need to understand my fans digitally, and many clubs were not prepared for that. So I've had a couple of questions from clubs asking, okay, how do we write an online fan strategy? How can we interact with our fans in a better way via our social channels? But also, once we reopen, what shall we do? Who do we invite back first? And imagine this situation where you go from 0% being allowed inside the stadium to 25% inside the stadium. Who do you invite first? Do you just randomly pick a number, or do you invite the fans with the most expensive season tickets first, or do you invite the fans who are in their first or second year first? These are very difficult questions to answer. And there's one club I've helped them with solving this problem, basically. I'm now working with a Scottish football club as well on a CRM strategy. So they weren't prepared yet in that CRM space. They didn't have a supplier yet. They didn't have their technological architecture ready. And so this club I'm now helping with, okay, let's get the tech pieces in place. And after that, I'm going to help them to hit the ground running, basically setting up that email marketing strategy and catching up on all the work that other clubs may have already done. And actually to provide them with insights on who are your fans exactly, where do they sit, how do you communicate with them? Those are mostly the questions that I get now.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I actually thought about this yesterday because I was watching an ice hockey game. And as I mentioned before, there are 500 people per section here. And I watched the game and I was thinking, I guess that you, of course, invite your season ticket holders before you sell additional tickets. But if you have more than 500 season tickets, how do you choose from these people?
Exactly.
As you said, like, how do you value them? That's interesting. And as you said, I guess it's that differs between every club, how they see that.
It depends a bit what your values are as a club. If your values are, or your preference goes to, I want to minimize my churn. I want to minimize the drop down from fans not renewing a season ticket commercially. Then you have way other choices to make than if when you are a club and you say, you know what, I want to have my most loyal fans back into the stadium because they've always been with me. So you would invite a completely different group. I would always vouch for a combination, because research has always shown that within any subscription, whether it's Netflix, Spotify, a newspaper, or a season ticket, the first 2 years are the critical years. So the churn there is quite high. And after something becomes a habit, people are less likely to cancel their subscription. So those first 2 years are very important. And that is also something you need to take into consideration. If you have 500 capacity and you have 400 people in their first or second year of season tickets, that's going to be a big chunk of the people you invite. But you also want to give some seats to those loyals. And you also want to give seats to the people that sit in the middle of that group. Very difficult. And yeah, data analytics can help with that, but it comes down to the business What do you prefer? Loyalty over commercial, or is it a blend?
Yeah, for sure. And now when you mentioned data analytics, a previous episode, I was talking to Fiona Green, and she also highly recommended that I speak to you. So how important is the data aspect? And I asked also Fiona this, like, in her opinion, not enough organizations are leveraging their data. Are you of the same opinion?
Well, first of all, Fiona always gives way better answers than I do. So that's the first. Secondly, we never disagree. So, yeah, I definitely agree with her. I think that a lot of clubs have data, but they don't have the capacities to actually understand that data. And that comes from a couple of factors. That's either a technical capacity, like the club that I'm working with now. There's also the human capacity to not fully understand what data houses. And then there's also the technical capacity of who can actually mine that data and who can actually translate that. And that's something that I gotta say, because I'm also consultant outside of football, and I see outside of football as well that quite some organizations are still struggling with translating the data and making that useful. And it doesn't matter which industry they're in. Still, bigger organizations are asking the questions where you would expect they've moved beyond already, but they haven't yet. And that is interesting, that apparently, as we sometimes think that with football that far behind as we are, we're sort of struggling with the same questions. Yes, CRM, other organizations outside of sports can invest more time and resource into those questions, but there are still questions that are also happening at the same time in football. So yes, there can always be done more with data. That's it, basically. You need to start somewhere, and mostly email marketing is a very nice and understandable, graspable way of starting to work with data, and from there you will expand. I don't know many clubs that actually apply machine learning in their business area, for example, and that is something that other industries they do. But yeah, this is a never-ending story. There's always more to do with data, but yeah, it comes down to time and money often.
Of course, if you have the data and you don't know how to read it, then it's useless. You need to know. And that goes back to the education that you mentioned. And that was another thing that Fiona mentioned, that there are not too many courses or educational paths today on data. And maybe some people are afraid to study it. Maybe they think it's too much mathematical. But yeah, that definitely also weighs in there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I come from a non-data background as well. I've done a bachelor's in sports marketing and I've done a master's in communications. So completely non-data related background. I have not studied a master in data analytics, data science, or whatever. But this is stuff that I've picked up on the side, learned how to program via DataCamp. I've done a postgraduate, which I'm still doing, by the way, in big data for management. So this is stuff I grasp along, stuff I find on the side of what I'm actually doing. And I think that's the best approach, because if you depart from the commercial area and then you move towards the data, it's way easier to understand how you can make the data useful than when you depart from a completely master in data science with neural networking and whatever. Great, but how do I make this applicable? That's often, that connection is very rare to successfully follow, where the other way from commercial towards the data, that's something that really helps well. And Fiona makes a good point. There are not a lot of study programs about it, not many sports related study programs, I would say. So yeah, that's the reason why she designed one. But there's so much non-sports related data analytics programs out there. I would always advise people to do that. Start learning SQL, quite easy. It's very high in demand. Barely anyone in sports business can fully understand those programming languages. So that gives you a massive advantage.
Yeah, for sure. I like that you say that you are still studying, because for sure, like, education never stops. It's not like you are done from university or high school or whatever, and then that's it. And I find it so fascinating because you are saying that you are studying right now. Also, there's been multiple guests on this podcast that they are, executives, managers that are high in their careers, and still they are going back to school because they want to improve, they want to learn more. And
exactly.
Yeah, I find that very inspiring.
Thank you. I think it's also very important to understand that you're never done with learning, because every time you will pick up new things along the way. And if you want to proceed, if you want to move further in your career, I think your appetite for knowledge will remain, but your appetite of knowledge grows as well. If I look back on how much I find studying interesting now compared to when I was doing my bachelor, I think that would have made an amazing difference. But now I really have the appetite more to understand new things, I also have my ambitions to move further in my career, to get higher up the career ladder, if there's even a ladder. But I think that learning part also there's so much out there at the moment that it's very hard to not find a program that's a good fit for you. Because there's universities with summer schools and winter schools. Fiona, for example, has a very specific niche course, but it's great in this area. And there's so many programs out there. I think it's nowadays compared to 10 years ago, it's very easy to continue learning.
I agree with you. On the topic of learning, you have created a model together with the previous guest, Jeff Wilson, that's been on this podcast. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I've created 2 models with Jeff. One model is the growing attendance model, and the other model is the data maturity model. Yeah, we designed the growing attendance model because from our consultancy experience, Jeff way more than I have, but we've both been consultants for UEFA Grow. I've worked at a club. He worked at the National Football Association of Ireland. So we both have similar but distinct experiences. And in our work, we both noticed that there was always these clubs trying to do more fan engagement, more community work, but never fully understanding how all the building blocks come together. And the clubs that we find most successful, and this is a vision I've borrowed from Mark Bradley from the Fan Experience Company. He explains it fantastically. He always says as well, the clubs that have it in their core, in their DNA, that clubs that truly understand their identity, they are the ones that actually successfully roll out fan engagement plans and community engagement projects because they depart from their core. And listeners to this podcast cannot see that, but here's the logo, I'm wearing a Levi's sweater from St. Pauli. And that might sound weird because Levi's have never done sports sponsoring, as far as I understand. Yes, in the US, but not here really in Europe. And yet this fits so well together because St. Pauli is also one of those clubs that truly understands what they are. They're a bit different than all the rest, and they're more into this music scene, and have been to the stadium in Hamburg. It's absolutely fantastic. And because they start from the core, they understand who they are, what their cultural values are, and what their mission statement as a club is, they are actually able to roll out these fan engagement initiatives successfully. Another example is Motherwell in Scotland, fantastic club that truly understands who says we are here to improve people's lives. And that is such a strong message as a club to have. And from there, they build on, they understand what type of community projects they need to do to improve people's lives. They understand what they need to do with their season cards as well. They said, for example, in this summer, they said, you know what, you haven't been able to visit any of our games. We'll renew it for free for you. And that's a very strong message to understand, okay, we are here to improve people's lives. We understand that we have it difficult as a business, but so do other people. And the fans that they have are maybe also not the most wealthiest fans. So they understand, okay, this is something that we give you. And of course, it's as a commercial aspect to it as well, because they hope that this summer, all those fans will renew and pay this time. But very strong messages. And that's what we've tried to do with the growing attendance model, to start from the bottom, cultural values, mission statement, vision, then go to leadership. So do you actually have the people in place inside the organization that are able to translate these values to the game plan that you have as a football club? And that's a very difficult exercise. Many non-sports businesses also don't know how to successfully translate this. But yeah, as a football club, you have a community role. So this part is really important. And from that point on, you start building your communication strategy, your marketing strategy, your fan engagement initiatives, etc.
Yeah, and the attendance question is very interesting to me because now with COVID, obviously people are not able to go to the stadiums. And in Sweden, they opened up for a while. for full attendance, and people were expecting just, packed stadiums, like everyone will start, like finally, like live audiences back. And that wasn't really the case. And I don't know if that is because people are still afraid to catch the virus, or if because we have gotten so used to digital now, when we have been home 2 years, we have been having meetings on Teams, we are having everything served digitally. And I mean, it's quite convenient watching a game from your house. I mean, you don't go anywhere. You have replays, you have commentary that explains to you what's going on. And do you think that there is a risk that live attendance will drop going forward?
Well, I don't have the data to back this because there hasn't been any research yet on getting from the pandemic restrictions back into stadiums. I haven't read much about any change in audiences, for example, but there was this morning, I had an interesting chat with someone from 7 League on Twitter about this, who claims that younger generations are more into the experience economy. They want to experience more things. So they claimed, or he said on personal note on Twitter, that he expects the younger generations to show up to the stadium again. But I challenge that because I think that will be a temporary effect, because in the basis, clubs have not put too much emphasis. It's not as if clubs now all of a sudden have figured out young audiences. So that's not the point. So I think it will just be some sort of like a catch-up effect. And as soon as that's been done, clubs will go back to normal, and they will get back to their usual routines with a bit of strategy development in there. Will all fans return? I don't know. I don't have any data on that. On a personal level, I would say yes, because I'm a romanticist. I'm not that much into metaverse and those kind of things. I like to see people, touch people, hear people, smell people, whatever. I'm more about the now, the actual universe that we're living. And I think with me, a lot of people. So I think a lot of people miss that vibe in a stadium as soon as a goal is scored, that you get the shivers on your back and that cheering. You don't get that kind of stuff in the metaverse. So I do think that people will return to the stadiums. And that's also something that you don't have with the TV experience. Yes, it's great that I can buy a couple of sound bars, a couple of speakers, and make my own home theater, but it's not the same as sitting in a stadium. So based on personal level, the data may say something completely different, and then I'm wrong. But so far, I keep the hope alive that people will return to stadiums.
And maybe, I mean, fan engagement might be more important than ever because of this, that the organizations that do it the best are the ones that will attract their fans back, and the ones who are not maybe losing some fans for attendance.
Indeed, I do think fans will start to realize, like, hey, what has my club done for me in these 2 years? The clubs that remain completely silent and just sat on the side and will potentially even ask fans for donations because they have it so difficult. I think these fans, these clubs will have a very hard time. The clubs that have invested in their fan relationship, that really showed their best effort during this pandemic to keep the fans engaged, I think those are the clubs that will actually rise out on top, and they are the ones that will actually get the most fans back to the stadium the earliest, because they've showed that this relationship is not just a one-way thing from fan to the club, but that clubs have actually returned the effort. And again, this needs to be a very nice piece of research, but I think that at least for the clubs that have remained quiet and stayed along the sidelines, fans will reflect on, okay, am I just bringing money to the club and I'm getting a ticket, or did we have some form of relationship, and do I realize that this is a one-way street? They will have it difficult.
This episode is sponsored by InSport Education, the online business school for sport. They offer a range of different courses, for example, Foundations of Sport Business, Private Equity in Sport, and much, much more. As a listener to this podcast, you get 10% off all of their courses using the code SPORTSMANAGEMENTPODCAST10. Click the link in the description below and sign up today. In the second segment, we usually like to get to know the guest a little better. So if we talk about you and your career within sports.
Okay. Shoe size 43.
Okay.
Is that not the type of question?
No, I was thinking mostly about your career journey. So I know you have worked for UEFA. I know you have worked with some consumer analytics. So if you can tell us how you started out in sports and your journey up until today.
Yeah, sure. So I did a bachelor's program in sports marketing. Yeah, I didn't really wanted to study business, but ended up studying that a bit. But with the sports layer to it, it was easier to digest. So that's what I've done. And actually, I graduated in 2012 when the previous crisis, we're still going to get one, financial crisis, but the previous one was still around and kicking. So I moved to Australia to get sports experience because A, it's not Europe. B, it's the Mecca of sports. Australia is absolutely, it's incredible. There's so much sports going on there, so many different sports, and the culture around sports is so great that I wanted to work in that and I wanted to learn from that and to then apply it back in Europe. So I moved to Australia, worked at, quite lucky also, to be honest, bit of bluffing sometimes that I just walked with a resume into a stadium saying, hey, I just arrived here from Amsterdam. I'm looking to work in sports. Do you have a job? So it's this kind of hustle that I've tried to do. And luckily there was one stadium that actually said, you know what, we can use people in the operational department. So they called me and I worked for them for most of my time in Australia, but also at the Australian Open. Also at the Champions Trophy, which is field hockey tournament. And I did got some great experiences in Australia. Unfortunately, after a year, I had to go back because they're very strict on immigration, or else I would have still been there. But so I went back, started my own consultancy, and that was a good learning experience for myself just to understand what the sports market is like. I really got to see that as a 24-year-old coming with this fluffy fan engagement concept, which I know now that I didn't know that well back then in 2013. So I did a lot of hustle, did a lot of working on the side also with this. So always during my studies, during the 2 years that I was having my consultancy full time, I always worked on the sides, on projects, on operational with events. So the Youth Olympics here in Utrecht. I did the World Championship Field Hockey in 2014 in The Hague. And I think that's very important for people that want to make a career in sports to understand that you do need to put the extra work in. Luckily, it's a lot of fun. So it's not that hard, but people that put the extra work in, those are the ones that come down floating on top of the pool. So that's very important. That's what I've done. And that was in the end also, I've decided to do a master's degree because I kind of felt that that was the next thing I had to do. And in 2016, I started working at AZ. And all of a sudden, all that experience that I've done, so all those weekends I've put in liaising teams around tournaments or whatever, all of a sudden was the cutting edge that they said, hey, that's interesting. You've always worked in sport. You showed your passion. We pick you over the other candidates. So yeah, there's a bit of luck and there's a lot of effort in it as well.
Yeah, definitely. And another question that I usually ask, which is if you have had any bumps on the road in your career. And if so, how you overcome them?
Plenty. That's how you overcome this. The biggest bump in my career, I think, is when I was working at AZ. I had to focus on CRM and fan engagement. And I thought that I was the absolute expert. And maybe by knowledge I was, because that was what I was focusing on for all those years. But the office politics game that comes with sports, I don't think that's being discussed enough. But office politics in football clubs, very important. And I was fresh out of university. I just did my master's degree in Belgium, came back, got this job at AZ, and I have not handled the office politics as well as I should. I was working under a manager that was very much a micromanager, very difficult to swim through. And there were a lot of micromanagers in the organization. Understanding that now, I know how I could have swum through that and still reach the results. But instead, because I was a bit stubborn, I constantly I didn't pick my battles. I chose all the battles. That was a big learning moment for myself. Got great results nonetheless. But I think that was the biggest bump, to understand how to handle the office politics in a football club.
What have you taken from that now? Because with your consultancy, obviously you work with some football clubs.
There's a situational difference that if you micromanage a consultant, then you're kind of throwing away your money. So that's something that clubs now don't do anymore. But my manager back then and his manager also, they were so much into the micromanagement that it kind of was taking the edge out. And that's the reason why I left AZ as well, because I was thinking, yeah, this is not what I want. This is more frustrating than joy. So that's why I left. Now I first went into media and I just changed into regular consulting in December. And those are great learning experiences as well. So this is all experience that I will bring back into football at some point. Hopefully a couple of layers higher than when I was working at AZ. But this is all stuff that I want to bring back into football. And that's also very important to realize for people that want to have a career in sports. Don't get all your experience in sports, because that's also limited. Conversation I've had with someone from City Football Group, a recruiter, she also said, if we have a candidate that has sports experience and a candidate, similar candidate that has non-sports experience, quite often we choose the non-sports experience one, because they're going to bring something new to the table. They're going to bring new ideas, new innovations, new fresh thoughts into the organization. And that's something important to realize as well. So if you do not have your first job in your career in sports, it could easily be your second job. It could easily be your third job. And the further you progress in your career, I think the bigger your chances will get to actually get a job into sports.
Yeah.
Your seniority goes up. And that means that you'll have more experience to bring to the table.
That's completely true and very interesting. Of course, it makes sense when you say that if you come in from a different field, you're bringing new experiences and new knowledge. And I think you answered my next question, but I will ask it anyways.
I always love to do that.
Yeah, because it is, what would be your best advice for people with aspirations to work in sports? So obviously now you said that you don't necessarily have to have a background in sports, that you can transition with experiences from another field. But what would be some other advice for someone with aspirations to work in sport?
Understand office politics. Understand that within sports, not always the best idea wins, but it's also quite often the one that is higher up the hierarchy, or the one that shouts the loudest in meetings. This is actual stuff that happens. I've not only seen this at AZ, I've also seen this at other football clubs. That's the way how decision making is done in football. Now it's not all bad. A lot of good stuff happening in football as well, but also quite some choices are being made irrationally. And that is something that I was not able to manage. Completely logic would go left and the choice nonetheless went right, even though all the benefits of going left were right there on the table. Something I had to learn, something I will bring now to the table as well of, hey, I've learned this, I've learned how to manage that, and I'll bring that back into sports in a couple of years. But that is something that I would say. So definitely, we've discussed education in the beginning, so never stop learning. The second point that I would want the listeners to take away from this is always do your side hustles, always work at your events or try to do some freelance work or whatever. Very important to get that, keep that going. Third point, to bring the experiences from other fields is it's not the worst to work somewhere else first and then go into any sport that you like. Yeah, and the fourth, be patient also. And then learn the office politics. That's another one. Understand that office politics do not always make sense, but it's very important in sports organizations.
It's funny because some people say that you should not mix politics with sports, but it's pretty obvious that they are very intertwined on so many levels.
Yeah, as I said, it's the 19th of January now, but we see that the pressure is being put on Beijing. The pressure is being put on Qatar. The Dutch Olympic Committee has, for whatever reason, agreed on the demands from the Olympic organizers that no one can bring their own phone and players will receive their Samsungs or whatever from the organization that they can use. And the Dutch Olympic Committee has just said, okay, we comply. And other national Olympic committees are starting to ask questions, but the Dutch have we just rolled into it and sure. And that caused some controversy. Now Qatar 2022 is coming up as well. And even though sports tries to stay away from the politics, it's very much there. And that's the whole reason why this World Cup went to Qatar, because it's a showcase. Look what we can do. And that's the whole reason why politicians get these major events, because it's their prestige or their city marketing plan. So 100% is politics. Well, not 100%, but you get my point.
Definitely. Approaching the end here, is there something that I haven't asked you that you would like to bring up?
No, I think a great conversation. I like it. I think I've given a couple of tips. I always like to give some tips to listeners. So those are the ones that I've just talked about a few minutes ago. That's it. Yeah.
Sure. I know that you're active on Twitter. You mentioned it before. So if the listeners want to get into a Twitter feud with you about fan engagement, how do they reach you on different platforms?
No word feud, but Twitter feud. Yeah. That they, yeah. And so on Twitter, I'm at Bas Schnater. So with my last name SCH, and you can easily find me on LinkedIn like that as well. Yeah. To any listeners, drop your comments on this episode on either Twitter or LinkedIn, and I'm happy to roll into conversations. It's always nice to speak to sports people. Yeah. Get in touch.
Perfect. The last question that I ask everyone is if you could choose the next guest on this podcast, who do you think that I should talk to from the world of sports?
Oh, this is a nice one. Well, you've already had Jeff. You've already had Fiona. You know what? Trevor Keane, Irish guy. He works in esports. And that's also a very nice topic, of course, to talk about. So he would be definitely someone that I would invite for this. Very difficult Irish accent, to be honest.
More difficult than Jeff's accent?
Similar, yeah, even more difficult. Yeah, Jeff is also sometimes when we're in meetings. I'm also sometimes like, "Huh, Jeff, rewind. What are you saying?" And he kind of goes into normal English. He does that sometimes. Oh, and Kenneth Kortze, also interesting. He's a professor in northern Denmark. He's a professor in sports management, sports economics. Very interesting. Always has lots of good stuff to share. So Trevor Keane and Kenneth Kortze would be the two guys I would recommend.
Two great tips there. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thanks for having me, and see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management Podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought about this episode. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram @sportsmpodcast.